Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we dig into the many ways politicians spend other people's money to buy votes. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Romina Boccia, Deputy Director of the Thomas Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, who walks us through the world of corporate welfare. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Michael Tanner, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and the author of Going for Broke, Deficits, Debt, and the Entitlement Crisis. Michael, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Mike, I asked you on to talk about a subject that has hardly come up in what must be the most bizarre presidential campaign in American history, and that's the national debt. Let me start with a confession. As terrifying as it deserves to be, your book, Going for Broke, made my eyes glaze over. The numbers are so big, the trail of irresponsibility stretches back so long through both parties, the culpability for this mess is so wide, and the potential solutions are so challenging that the mind just reels. What's it going to take to get this subject back on the table?
Well, I think people need to understand that this has an impact on their lives today. This is not just about the fact that we're leaving a huge debt to our children and our grandchildren, which is enormously unfair. This is actually slowing the economy today. We earn less. We have fewer jobs. We actually are in a worse situation right now. We talk about the slow economic growth that's going on. Part of that is because of the debt overhang that we're facing today. We really need to do something now, not wait on this.
How deep a hole have our politicians dug for us if you add up both on-balance sheet debt and unfunded liabilities?
Well, when people talk about the national debt, most people are talking about the official sort of on-the-books debt. And that's a little over $18 trillion right now, which is real money, even in Washington. But you also have to look at the unfunded future liabilities of programs like Social Security, Medicare, civil service pensions, and so on. This is money that we promised that we don't have taxes dedicated to pay in the future. And that adds up to somewhere, depending on Medicare future costs, it could be anywhere from $70 or $80 trillion on up to as much as $130, $140 trillion. That's a mind-boggling, eye-glazing number. One way to look at it is right now we owe about 100% of gross domestic product. That means our debt is higher than everything we produce in this country over the course of a year. It's a little bit like as if your credit card bills exceeded your entire pre-tax salary. That would be a sign you've got a problem.
So why can't the government just go on borrowing and printing money to pay its bills forever? It's worked this long.
Well, in theory, it could, as long as there was somebody willing to buy that debt. If you write an IOU, somebody has to take that IOU from you, and they're going to do that on the assumption that you pay it back. But the more debt you write, the more of those IOUs that are out there, the worse it becomes as a credit risk. People begin to doubt whether or not you're ever going to be able to pay all that back. And they begin to demand that you pay more interest on that you make it a better deal for them. And every 1% rise in interest rates is about $130 billion that we have to pay to those bondholders. And, of course, that's money that's simply wasted. It's money that we don't have, whether you're a liberal and you want to spend it on education or welfare, or you're a conservative and you want to buy some more tanks and planes. You're not doing either with money you pay for interest. That money is simply gone. I mean, think about your credit card again. The money that you're paying to the bank in interest is money you're not using to buy that new car or big screen TV. That's simply gone.
So if the federal government is essentially insolvent, if you look at all those deep numbers, and is becoming a credit risk, why is the civilized world falling all over itself to lend Uncle Sam money at ridiculously low interest rates?
Well, because we're essentially the fastest horse in the glue factory. I mean, where else are they going to put that money right now? You look around the world and you say, well, the euro is certainly a mess. Nobody's rushing to buy renminbi right now. The ruble's not exactly a great investment. So if you're out there and you're looking for where to stick money, the United States is still the best bet you've got. On the other hand, if you look to what people are thinking for the future, there are signs for worry. The Chinese, for example, are beginning to move from 30-year bonds to 10-year bonds. That suggests that they're thinking the long-term fiscal health of the United States may not be so good in the future.
Well, what makes all these American and foreign federal government debt holders, plus all the entitlement beneficiaries, believe that future Americans, and in particular millennials when they grow up, are going to willingly become lifelong debt slaves?
Well, that's a very good question, and there certainly are economists out there who worry about that. Larry Kotlikoff, who's the head of the economics department at Boston University, for example, believes that one of these days the bond market is simply going to blow up because people are going to wake up one day and realize that a 30-year government bond is not a good investment. Other people think that we do have some inherent advantages. We are the world reserve currency still. We are the largest economy in the world, which enables us to carry much more debt than others. We are in control of our own finances, unlike Europe, where they're sort of in hock to the European Central Bank. So we do have some advantages that may offset some of the bad news. The question is for how long?
You know, if the credit markets turn, how much money could Uncle Sam raise in a pinch if the federal government started selling off assets? You know, things like oil and gas leases and even the Grand Canyon.
No one really knows. It's very hard to get a valuation on federal assets, in part because they're not for sale, and so nobody's ever bid on them. You're sort of just taking the wide estimates. And the second is, of course, in any sort of fire sale, if you put a whole bunch of these on the market all at once, it lowers the value. It's like anything else. If you suddenly increase the supply, you're going to drive down whatever the book price is on these. But it's no doubt that there's certainly be trillions of dollars out there. You have, for example, things like Camp Pendleton, which sits on some of the prime beachfront in the nation. I'm sure there's people who'd love to build condos out there. On the other hand, I'm not sure how fast we're going to be to sell off marine bases.
Why won't a massive Weimar Republic-style hyperinflation be used to effectively wipe out America's debts? I mean, isn't that the path of least political resistance, and that it would allow most politicians and both political parties to dodge the blame by, you know, turning Janet Yellen or her successors into the fall guy?
Well, of course, we've already seen some of this with the various QE 227 or whatever we are out there right now. And don't forget, it wasn't that long ago that Paul Krugman seriously proposed that we create a $1 trillion coin in order to pay off the debt. He has written several times that he thinks we need to have more inflation in this country. Now, inflation, of course, is a terrible thing, particularly for people who live on fixed incomes like senior citizens and low-income individuals. It's really a horrible tax on the people who can least afford it. But politically, it's something that a lot of politicians might not be so unhappy about. It sort of gets them off the hook for making tough choices.
A little while ago, we had Jerry Jordan, the retired president of the Cleveland Federal Reserve, on the air, and he claims that the central banks have no tools whatsoever that can control runaway inflation once it gets ignited. What happens to the value of the bonds, the long bonds that are sitting out there at 1 or 2%, if inflation goes to 14%?
Yeah, it certainly would crunch the bond market. I mean, I'm not sure that there's no tools that central banks have. They can try and rip money out in a hurry. Remember the Volcker experiment the last time we had hyperinflation. But that certainly is painful. And we've seen in other countries what happens in terms of a recession and then, you know, Greek-like austerity. We don't really want to see that in this country.
So, Mike, come back around to the current economy. You mentioned that all this debt is a drag on growth. Exactly how does that work?
Well, economists suggest that you can carry a certain amount of debt, just like with your home, in your home budget. Nobody expects you necessarily to live debt-free. You have loans for your car or your house or so on. And if that money is being used for investment, that you may be fine. But after a certain point, you can't keep up with that debt. And the same essentially happens with the government economy. Economists suggest that you can carry around, 80% of GDP, perhaps, in government debt without it having a huge impact. But after you get over that point, you begin to slow economic growth as the debt grows. As I mentioned earlier, we already owe on the books 100% of GDP, which means our economy is growing slower than it might otherwise do. And if you take the off-the-books debt, that totals to something like 500 to 800% of GDP. Businesses look at that debt, and they eventually translate that into higher taxes in the future. They know that if they're ever going to pay that debt back, it means taxes coming back on them. So they're less likely to invest in new businesses, new plants, hiring additional workers, and so on. And that leaves us all worse off.
So, Michael, let's dig into the major debt sinkholes one at a time, starting with Social Security. Why do people say that Social Security will go bankrupt in 2028 when it's already paying out more in benefits than it's taking in payroll taxes? I mean, the $3 trillion supposedly in the trust fund consists of nothing but IOUs Congress issued in return for pillaging the money that was supposed to be set aside for future retirees. Why do those unbacked IOUs count?
Well, those IOUs are essentially a bookkeeping method telling us how much the Congress owes the Social Security system. It's not so much that they pillaged the money, it's that government is structurally incapable of saving. If you consider that until about 5 or 6 years ago, Social Security ran a slight surplus, more money coming in than it was spending, that money had to go somewhere. They can't put it in a cigar box and bury it out behind the Treasury building. They have to do something with it. So they buy government bonds. And once you buy a government bond, that money is general revenue of the federal government. And it's spent on whatever the federal government spends money on, whether that's building roads and bridges or invading Middle Eastern nations. That money is gone. And the Social Security system then holds this IOU that tells you how much the federal government will pay back out of general revenues when those IOUs come due. And last year, they had to cash in about $65 billion worth of those IOUs, and that meant the federal government had to come up with $65 billion, which, of course, it doesn't have. It had to borrow that money or raise taxes or something of that nature to get that $65 billion. You know, $65 billion in the scheme of a $3.5 trillion federal budget is not that much, so we barely noticed it. But within a very few years, we're going to be talking about $200 or $300 billion in bonds that have to be redeemed every year. And that's going to make a big dent in our federal budget.
When you say cashed in these IOUs, I don't understand, because those are not T-bills sitting in those file cabinets in West Virginia. They're not negotiable instruments that you can sell on the market. They're literally IOUs to Congress.
That's exactly right. They are a special issue Treasury bond that's not tradable. But they do have the force of law of any other credit instrument that the federal government issues. So basically, the Congress is obligated to repay them. So what they do is they take $65 billion in these bonds out. They go to general revenue. They say, give us $65 billion. And Congress has to find that $65 billion to pay it back. It's a legal obligation that the general revenues have. But, of course, it's not an actual asset.
Can Congress pass a new law changing that legal obligation anytime it chooses?
Theoretically, they could, although there is a constitutional provision that says that you cannot question the legal debt of the federal government. So there'd be some objection if Congress tried to do that. But, yeah, they could simply change the way Social Security benefits are paid out, and that would change the time length or the length of time over which those bonds are ultimately paid back.
So that raises the question, if Congress keeps kicking the can and waits until 2028 to address the Social Security problem, how much would benefit payouts have to be reduced to match payroll tax revenue?
26% if you waited until the last moment. And it's actually an odd provision. It's not that your checks would be reduced by 26% every month. What would happen is they would pay benefits until they ran out of money, and then 75% of the way through the year, they would stop issuing checks altogether. So you'd get 100% and then zero.
Well, that would be a lot of fun come Christmas, huh?
Well, that's exactly right, which suggests they're not really going to do that. The last time we ran into that situation was 1983, when you had the Greenspan Commission and Reagan and Tip O'Neill sort of propped up Social Security for a few more years. That's likely what's going to happen again. The problem is if we wait, whatever you have to do, whether it's raise taxes or cut benefits, or make other changes in the system, because it's much more painful to do. You have to make big changes all at once rather than small changes phased in over time.
Well, speaking of small changes, can the program be fixed by tinkering at the margin, say by slightly raising the retirement age or increasing the salary cap subject to payroll taxes?
Not small changes. They really are going to have to be fairly significant. Social Security is deep in debt, about $26 trillion according to the latest trustees report. That $26 trillion, to get really down in the weeds for all the wonks out there, is the discounted present value over the infinite horizon. And that means that if we had an extra $26 trillion today that we could stick in the bank and it earned 3% interest, then we could go ahead and pay all the Social Security benefits we owe for as long as we need to. Unfortunately, the federal government doesn't happen to have $26 trillion laying around right now, so we've got a problem.
What would Social Security look like if it were turned into a means-tested welfare program rather than a broad-based entitlement program?
Yeah, you certainly could means test the program. I mean, it seems kind of silly to be sending Warren Buffett and Bill Gates a Social Security check every year. But surprisingly, there's not enough millionaires and billionaires out there to bring the system into balance. You'd actually have to means test at a fairly low level. People earning $25,000 or $30,000 a year, you'd probably have to begin phasing out their Social Security benefits to bring the system into balance simply by means testing. That would create a lot of problems with people who paid into the system and don't feel like they're getting money back.
Chile successfully privatized its Social Security system 35 years ago, and it's been a smashing success for both retirees and for the Chilean economy. What stops the U.S. from doing the same?
Well, actually, about 35 countries have moved to either in total or in part to a more investment-based Social Security system. That is allowing, let's say, younger workers to take some of what they're paying in Social Security tax and then invest that through private accounts in some form of return-bearing assets, stocks, bonds, annuities, things of that nature. There really is a strong movement throughout Latin America, Central and Eastern Europe, Asia, to move in this sort of direction. The problem is twofold. One is that it's easy for special interest groups to scare senior citizens by saying that this is going to somehow put their benefits at risk, which it's not. But more importantly, there's a question of how you make the transition to that type of system. When you pay your Social Security taxes, none of that money currently is saved for your retirement. Social Security is really sort of a giant pyramid scheme. When you pay your Social Security taxes, that money is used for people who are already retired, for grandma, if you will. And that means that if you were allowed to save your Social Security taxes for your own retirement, who would pay grandma's Social Security benefits? We have to find a way to make that transition to pay that additional money over the short term in order to save money in the long term. And politicians will always put things off for the long term rather than accept short-term pain.
So assuming they solve that transition problem the way 35 other countries did, what answer do you give to people when they claim that it's too risky to invest Social Security money in individual accounts, in stocks and bonds, rather than hand it over to Congress for safekeeping?
Well, I think you have to look at two different types of risk. The current Social Security system has political risk. It is a system that has promised benefits it cannot deliver. With our current tax structure, the current amount of taxes that young people are paying today, we cannot deliver the benefits that we have promised in the future. Social Security, as I mentioned, is $26 trillion in the red. We simply don't have that money. That's a political risk that recipients are facing, that someday Congress is going to cut their benefits. In fact, almost certainly going to cut their benefits. On the other hand, you can look at the market risk. Now, markets are volatile. They go up and down. But we're talking about a very long-term investment horizon. For a young person today, we're talking about investing over 30 or 40 years. We've never had a period of private investment in this country in which you would have lost money investing over that period of time. Is it theoretically possible? Sure. But if we're going to have a market that collapses for the next 40 years, we've probably got bigger problems in this country than just the Social Security system.
Well, speaking of bigger problems, although the fiscal situation for Social Security looks bad, Medicare appears to be even worse. How much of the federal budget today consists of Medicare payouts, and how is this forecast to grow?
Yeah, Social Security right now is the largest single government program in the world. It's about 25% of our federal budget. Medicare, I believe, is around a little over 15% right now. But it's going to continue to grow, and it will eventually outpace Social Security. It's also much more in debt than Social Security. Medicare, depending on how you want to treat future health care costs, could have an unfunded liability in excess of $50 or $60 trillion. So that's real money. Even makes Social Security look almost solvent.
How has the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, impacted the fiscal condition of Medicare?
Well, it sort of played games with the fiscal condition of Medicare. Remember during the presidential election, the last one, we had this big debate about whether Obamacare was going to cut $716 billion out of Medicare over 10 years. Mitt Romney accused President Obama of cutting that money and said it was terrible that they were taking money out of Medicare. The president said he would never take $716 billion out of Medicare. I said Medicare is $50 trillion in debt. I wish somebody would take $716 billion out of it. The reality was a little bit of both. Obamacare does cut Medicare by about $700 billion and uses that money to subsidize other types of health care in the healthcare system. But it does so in this weird Washington accounting way of routing that money through the trust fund, so it technically extends the life of this Medicare trust fund. Only in Washington can you spend the same dollar twice. So they spend the money on Medicare, and then they also spend the money on Obamacare and count it both times.
We've done quite a few shows on the healthcare situation in the country, and we recently talked to a guest who described self-pay as the fastest growing segment of the American healthcare market. If too many doctors abandon the current system to go work in the self-pay segment, can some of them be legally forced to accept Medicare patients?
You can't be legally forced to accept Medicare patients, at least at the federal level. But they can say that if you don't accept all Medicare patients, you can't accept any Medicare patients. One of the things doctors run into is a patient has a Medicare-eligible condition, and the doctor says he doesn't want to accept Medicare payments. They cannot accept any Medicare payments for, I believe it is 2 years after that. So that sort of forces doctors into that situation. It particularly affects hospitals, which depend on Medicare for a lot of their income.
So, Michael, if you look at the big picture, if you can make it through your book without killing yourself, and you try to see a little bit ahead, is the United States becoming Greece?
Actually, if you look at the last 25 years of the growth of Greek debt, and you were to superimpose a graph looking at the projected growth of our debt over the next 25 years, you would actually see that the two graphs coincide. So we are certainly heading down that Greek path. One of the things that concerns me terribly is that in the upcoming presidential election, neither of the major party candidates seems willing to address this ongoing debt problem. Donald Trump has said that he would make no changes whatsoever to the current Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid systems. That's putting half the federal budget off the table in terms of debt restructuring or in terms of making any reforms. Hillary Clinton has said that she wants to increase spending on Social Security and Medicare. So you don't have anyone seeming to step up to the plate and be willing to address this huge economic problem that is staring us in the face, and that really worries me.
Well, Mike, just like your book, you've left us with some nice, cheery thoughts. Thanks for coming on the show, and let's keep in touch as this story unfolds.
Well, it's been a great discussion, and I hope we have a chance to do it again.
That was Michael Tanner, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and the author of Going for Broke, Deficits, Debt, and the Entitlement Crisis, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. To make sure you don't miss any of our shows, stop by realclearradio.org and sign up for updates. We'd like to thank our newest sponsor, Donors Trust, the donor-advised fund committed to promoting a free society. For more information, visit donorstrust.org. Ahead, Romina Boccia from the Heritage Foundation joins us to take a look at the world of corporate welfare. Stay tuned.
The Competitive Enterprise Institute is a nonprofit public interest group based in Washington, D.C., promoting innovation and entrepreneurship for a prosperous and peaceful society. Visit CEI.org to learn more.